The room had been sealed for 50 years, and I was the one who found it. That fact still haunts me, still visits me in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refuses to come and the darkness presses in around me like a living thing. I was not supposed to be the one who found it. I was just a contractor, a man who had spent his entire adult life tearing down walls and putting up new ones, a man whose hands were calloused from years of swinging a hammer and whose back ached from decades of bending over blueprints and building plans. I had been hired to renovate an old house that had been sitting empty for decades, a job that was supposed to be simple and straightforward and utterly unremarkable. Tear down some walls, update the plumbing, bring the electrical system into the 21st century. The kind of work I had done 100 times before in 100 different houses, without anything unusual ever happening. But this house was different. This house had been waiting for someone to uncover its secret, and I was the one who walked through the door on that cold October morning, completely unaware that my life was about to change forever. The house was called Blackthorn Manor, a name that had been given to it by the locals who had grown up in its shadow and who spoke of it in hushed tones and with furtive glances over their shoulders. It was located at the end of a long, winding road on the outskirts of a small town called Millbrook, a place so quiet and so remote that it barely registered on most maps. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where the same families had lived for generations, where strangers were noticed immediately and discussed endlessly over coffee at the local diner. It was not the kind of place that usually attracted attention from the outside world, but Blackthorn Manor had always been an exception. The house had a reputation, a dark history that clung to it like the ivy that covered its walls. It had been built in 1892 by a wealthy industrialist named Theodore Ashford, a man whose name was still whispered in Millbrook with a mixture of respect and unease. Ashford had made his fortune in textiles, building factories across the Northeast and employing thousands of workers in conditions that were, by modern standards, appalling. But in his day, he was considered a pillar of the community, a man of vision and ambition who had put Millbrook on the map. He had built Blackthorn Manor as a testament to his success, a sprawling Victorian mansion with a turret on one side and a wraparound porch and more rooms than anyone could reasonably need. It was the grandest house in the county, and for decades, it had been the center of social life for the region's elite. But the Ashford family's fortunes had declined over the generations. Theodore's son, William, had tried to continue the family business but had lacked his father's ruthless drive. The factories had closed one by one, the money had dwindled, and by the time the third generation came of age, the Ashfords were a shadow of their former selves. They still lived in Blackthorn Manor, but they could no longer afford to maintain it. The grand rooms fell into disrepair, the gardens became overgrown, and the family retreated into a smaller and smaller portion of the house, closing off wings and floors as they could no longer afford to heat them. The last of the Ashfords had died 50 years ago, or so the town believed. The official story was that the remaining family members had moved away, relocating to another part of the country to start over. The house had been left empty, tied up in legal disputes between distant relatives who couldn't agree on what to do with it. Over the decades, it had become a local legend, a haunted house that children dared each other to approach on Halloween, a subject of endless speculation and rumor. Some said the Ashfords had fled because of debts. Some said they had been cursed. Some said there had been a murder, a scandal so terrible that the family had been forced to disappear. No one knew the truth, and no one had ever bothered to find out. Until now. The current owner of Blackthorn Manor was a man named Richard Hartley, a real estate developer from the city who had more money than sense and a habit of buying historic properties and turning them into boutique hotels. He had purchased the house at auction for a fraction of what it was worth, drawn by the Victorian architecture and the potential for profit. He had hired my crew to handle the renovations, and we had spent the better part of 2 weeks stripping away the accumulated debris of decades of neglect. It was hard work, dirty work, but it was also strangely satisfying. There was something about taking an old, forgotten place and bringing it back to life that appealed to me on a deep, almost primal level. My crew was small but experienced. There was Mike Kowalski, my foreman, a gruff, heavy-set man in his 50s who had been working in construction since he was a teenager and who knew more about old houses than anyone I had ever met. There was Carlos Mendez, a young guy in his 20s who was strong and eager and always willing to do the hardest jobs. There was Dave Simmons, a quiet, methodical man who specialized in finish work and who could make a piece of trim look like it had been there for 100 years. And there was me, Jack Morrison, the owner of Morrison Contracting, a man who had built his business from nothing and who took pride in doing quality work at a fair price. We had been working on the second floor of Blackthorn Manor for 3 days, tearing out the old plaster walls to make way for new drywall. The work was loud and messy and physically demanding, the kind of work that left you exhausted at the end of the day, but also gave you a strange sense of satisfaction. There was something cathartic about demolition, about taking something old and broken and making way for something new. At least, that was what I told myself as I swung my sledgehammer into another section of wall, sending chunks of plaster crashing to the floor in a cloud of white dust. It was my hammer that first revealed the secret. I had been working on a wall at the end of a long, narrow corridor on the second floor, a corridor that had always seemed slightly strange to me. It was narrower than the other hallways in the house, and it ended abruptly in a blank wall that didn't seem to serve any purpose. Why would anyone design a hallway that led to nothing? Why would anyone build a wall in a place where there should have been a door or a window or at least a closet? I had noticed this oddity on our first day in the house, but I had dismissed it as a quirk of Victorian architecture. Old houses were full of strange, inexplicable features. Rooms that were slightly the wrong shape, doors that opened onto brick walls, staircases that led nowhere. It was part of their charm, part of what made them interesting to work on. But when my hammer broke through the plaster and revealed not the empty space between studs, but a solid, wooden surface, I knew that my initial instinct had been correct. This wall was not just a wall. It was hiding something. I stopped swinging and called out to Mike, who was working in the next room. "Hey, Mike," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. "Come take a look at this." Mike appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with dust, his expression curious. "What did you find? Buried treasure?" "Not sure yet," I said, pointing to the section of wall I had been working on. "Look at this. There's wood behind the plaster. Solid wood. It looks like some kind of door." Mike came closer, squinting at the exposed section. He reached out and ran his hand over the wood, his fingers tracing the grain. "You're right," he said, his voice thoughtful. "That's oak. Old oak. And it's not structural. Someone built this deliberately." He stepped back, looking at the wall with new eyes. "It's a hidden door. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure no one would find this." Carlos and Dave had appeared behind him, drawn by the sound of our voices. They crowded into the narrow corridor, their flashlights cutting through the dusty gloom. The four of us stood there, staring at the section of wall that I had exposed, and I could feel the excitement building in the air. We had all been doing this job for a long time, and we had all encountered strange things in old houses. Hidden compartments, secret passages, forgotten rooms. But there was something about this particular discovery that felt different. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Should we open it?" Carlos asked, his voice eager. "Maybe there's something valuable inside. Gold, or jewelry, or old coins. My uncle found a box of silver dollars in a wall once. Paid for his daughter's wedding. Whatever it is, it's been sealed for a long time," Mike said, examining the edges of the hidden door. "Look at these nails. They're old, hand-forged. And there's no handle, no hinges on this side. This door was meant to be opened from the other side. Someone sealed it from the inside." The implications of that statement hung in the air between us. Sealed from the inside. Someone had been inside that room, whatever it was, and they had nailed the door shut behind them. Why would anyone do that? What could possibly be in that room that was worth sealing yourself in to protect? "Only one way to find out," I said, and I raised my hammer again. It took us nearly an hour to break through the door. It was solid oak, 3 inches thick, and it had been nailed shut with dozens of iron nails that had rusted over the decades into a solid mass. We had to work carefully, prying the nails loose one by one, trying not to damage the door more than necessary. The whole time, I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that we were about to uncover something that was meant to stay hidden. But I pushed the feeling aside. I was a contractor, not an archaeologist. My job was to renovate this house, and that meant dealing with whatever we found inside its walls. When the last nail was removed, I grasped the edge of the door and pulled. It didn't move at first, stuck fast by decades of disuse. I pulled harder, and Mike and Carlos joined me, their hands gripping the edge of the door beside mine. Together, we heaved, and with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house, the door swung open. The first thing that hit us was the smell. It was not just the smell of dust and stale air, the smell that you would expect from a room that had been sealed for decades. It was something else, something older and darker and more disturbing. It was the smell of decay, of things that had died and been left to rot. It was so strong that I gagged, my hand flying to cover my nose and mouth. Behind me, I heard Carlos retching, and Dave swore under his breath. The room beyond the door was completely dark. No windows, no light fixtures, no opening of any kind except for the door we had just forced open. The darkness was absolute, a darkness that seemed to swallow the beams of our flashlights and give nothing back. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. The darkness was so complete that it seemed almost solid, almost like a physical barrier that we would have to push through. "Get the work lights," I said, my voice coming out hoarse and strange. "I want to see what's in there before anyone goes inside." Dave brought the portable work lights from the other room, the kind that we use to illuminate dark corners during renovations. We set them up in the doorway, angling them into the room, and when we turned them on, the darkness retreated. And then we saw what was inside. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with walls that were bare and unpainted. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust that had accumulated over decades, undisturbed by any living thing. There was no furniture, no decorations, no signs of human habitation except for one thing. In the center of the room, arranged in a neat circle, were 5 wooden chairs. They were simple chairs, the kind you might find around a dining room table, made of dark wood with high backs and carved armrests. And sitting in each chair, their hands folded in their laps, their heads bowed as if in prayer, were 5 human skeletons. The silence that followed was the deepest I have ever experienced. It was not just the absence of sound. It was a presence, a weight, a physical force that pressed down on us and stole the breath from our lungs. We stood in the doorway, frozen, staring at the scene before us, our minds struggling to process what our eyes were seeing. The work lights cast harsh shadows across the room, making the skeletons seem to move and shift in the flickering illumination. For one horrible moment, I had the irrational thought that they were alive, that they were going to lift their heads and look at us. The skeletons were dressed in clothing that had long since rotted away to scraps, but enough remained to indicate that they had been wearing formal attire. The men were in suits, dark wool suits that had held up better than the rest of their garments. The women were in dresses, long dresses with high collars and tight sleeves, the kind of dresses that were worn 50 years ago for special occasions. There were 3 men and 2 women, their skeletal hands folded neatly in their laps, their skulls bowed forward on their chests. The posture was almost peaceful, almost serene, as if they had simply sat down and gone to sleep and never woken up. But there was nothing peaceful about the reality of what had happened here. These people had died in this room. They had been locked inside, sealed behind a hidden door, and they had died here, alone in the darkness. The chairs were still arranged in their circle, still facing each other, as if they had been having a conversation when the end came, as if they had been waiting for something. Someone. I was the first to break the silence. "Nobody touch anything," I said, my voice coming out in a whisper that I barely recognized as my own. "Nobody go inside. We need to call the police. Right now." Mike nodded, his face pale beneath the dust and grime. "I'll make the call," he said, and he turned and walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Carlos was still staring at the skeletons, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have they been here? Why would anyone do this?" "I don't know," I said, "but I think we're about to find out." The investigation that followed was the largest in the history of Millbrook. The police arrived within minutes of Mike's call, a pair of officers from the local department who took one look at the scene and immediately radioed for backup. Within an hour, the house was swarming with law enforcement. The county sheriff arrived, then the state police, and eventually the FBI. Blackthorn Manor was sealed off with yellow crime scene tape, transforming it from a construction site into a crime scene, the kind of place where grim-faced investigators in white protective suits moved slowly and deliberately, collecting evidence and taking photographs and speaking in hushed, reverent tones. My crew and I were questioned extensively. We told the investigators everything we knew, which wasn't much. We had been hired to renovate the house. We had found the hidden door. We had opened it and discovered the skeletons. That was all. We had no connection to the Ashford family, no knowledge of the house's history, no idea what had happened here. We were just contractors, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the investigators were interested in more than just our story. They wanted to know about the house itself, about the construction, about the hidden door, and how it had been concealed. Mike and I walked them through the corridor, showing them the way the wall had been built, the way the plaster had been applied, the way the door had been designed to blend seamlessly into its surroundings. It was expert work, we told them. Someone with real skill had created this hidden room. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The skeletons were removed one by one, each of them treated with a care and respect that was almost ceremonial. They were placed in body bags and carried out of the house on stretchers, their bony hands still folded in their laps, their skulls still bowed in that eternal posture of prayer. The medical examiner would later determine that they had been dead for approximately 50 years, that the cause of death was starvation and dehydration, and that there were no signs of physical violence on any of the remains. They had simply been locked in a room and left to die. But who were they? And why had they been sealed in that room? And who had done this to them? The answers began to emerge over the following days and weeks, as investigators pieced together the fragments of evidence that had been scattered across half a century. The skeletons were identified through dental records and DNA analysis as members of the Ashford family. Theodore Ashford, the patriarch who had built Blackthorn Manor. His wife, Eleanor, who had been known in the town for her charitable work and her beautiful singing voice. Their son, William, who had tried and failed to keep the family business alive. William's wife, Margaret, who had married into the family and who had been described by those who remembered her as quiet and devoted. And their daughter, Catherine, who had been only 19 years old at the time of her death. 5 members of a family that had supposedly moved away 50 years ago, leaving their ancestral home empty and abandoned. That was the story the town had been told. That was the story everyone had believed. The remaining Ashfords had packed up their belongings and relocated to another part of the country, seeking a fresh start after years of financial decline. But the truth was that they had never left. They had been here all along, sealed in a hidden room, waiting for a rescue that never came. The medical examiner's report was detailed and clinical, but the picture it painted was anything but detached. The Ashford family had died slowly, over a period of days or possibly even weeks. There was evidence that they had tried to escape, scratch marks on the inside of the door where they had clawed at the wood with their fingernails. There was evidence that they had tried to ration whatever food and water they had with them, though it clearly hadn't been enough. And there was evidence, heartbreaking evidence, that they had tried to comfort each other in their final hours. The skeletons were arranged in their circle, facing each other, as if they had been holding hands when they died. But the most significant discovery, the one that would ultimately provide the key to understanding what had happened in that room, came not from the medical examiner or the forensic investigators. It came from a diary found tucked inside the dress of the youngest victim, Catherine Ashford. The diary was small, a leather-bound volume with a brass clasp that had kept it closed for 50 years. It had been remarkably well preserved by the dry, cool conditions of the sealed room. the paper still intact, the ink still legible. In its pages, Catherine had documented the final weeks of her family's life, and the story she told was one of madness and manipulation and a betrayal so profound that it defied comprehension. According to the diary, the Ashford family had not simply been the victims of a random crime or a tragic accident. They had been members of a secret society, a religious cult that believed the end of the world was imminent. The leader of this cult was a man named Jonathan Crane, a charismatic preacher who had arrived in Millbrook in the summer of 1950 and had quickly attracted a following among the town's disaffected and desperate. Crane was a tall, striking man with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could command a room. He spoke of salvation and redemption, of a coming apocalypse that would cleanse the world of sin and suffering. He promised his followers that if they trusted him, if they followed his instructions without question, they would be saved. The Ashford family had been among his most devoted followers. Theodore, the patriarch, had been drawn to Crane's message of hope in a time of despair. The family's fortune had been dwindling for years, and Theodore saw in Crane a chance for redemption, a way to restore meaning to his life. Eleanor, his wife, had been more skeptical at first, but she had eventually been won over by Crane's charisma and the fervent belief of her husband and children. William and Margaret had been fully committed, attending every meeting, contributing what little money they had left to the cause. And Catherine, young and impressionable, had fallen completely under Crane's spell. She wrote about him in her diary with a devotion that bordered on worship, describing him as a prophet, a savior, a man sent by God to lead them to paradise. The end of the world, according to Crane, was scheduled for a specific date. October 31st, 1950. On that night, he told his followers, a great destruction would sweep across the earth, cleansing it of the wicked and the unworthy. Only those who were pure of heart, those who had devoted themselves completely to his teachings, would survive. And the way to survive, Crane instructed, was to seal themselves away from the corrupt world, to build sanctuaries, hidden rooms where they could wait out the destruction in safety. When the apocalypse was over, Crane would come for them. He would lead them out of their sanctuaries and into a new world, a world of peace and plenty and eternal salvation. The Ashford family had followed his instructions to the letter. They had built a hidden room in their own house, a sanctuary where they would be safe. They had gathered supplies, food and water and candles and blankets. They had dressed in their finest clothes, because Crane had told them that they would be entering a new world and should look their best. And on the night of October 31st, 1950, they had gathered in that room, closed the door behind them, and waited. But Jonathan Crane had not joined them. He had promised to be there, had promised to lead them to salvation, but he had not come. Instead, he had sealed the door from the outside, nailing it shut and covering it with plaster and wallpaper, erasing all evidence that it had ever existed. And then he had simply disappeared, leaving the Ashford family to die in the darkness. The final entries in Catherine's diary were almost unbearable to read. The handwriting, which had started out neat and precise, became increasingly shaky and irregular as the days passed. She wrote about the darkness, the terrible, absolute darkness that pressed in on them from all sides. She wrote about the hunger, the thirst, the way her throat had become so dry that she could barely swallow. She wrote about the way her parents had tried to comfort each other, the way her father had held her mother's hand and told her that everything was going to be all right, even when it was obvious that nothing was ever going to be all right again. She wrote about the moment when they had all realized that Jonathan Crane was not coming back. It had been a week, maybe more, though it was hard to keep track of time in the darkness. The food was gone. The water was gone. The candles had burned down to nothing. And still, there was no sign of Crane, no sound of his voice, no indication that the apocalypse had come or that salvation was on its way. It was her father, Theodore, who had finally spoken the words that everyone else was too afraid to say. "We have been deceived," he had said, his voice hollow and broken. "Crane is not coming. He never intended to come. We have been sealed in this room to die." The diary described what happened next in heartbreaking detail. Her mother had wept, great heaving sobs that echoed in the small, dark space. Her brother William had raged, pounding on the door with his fists until his hands were bloody. Margaret, William's wife, had retreated into silence, her face blank and expressionless, as if she had already left her body behind. And Catherine, young Catherine, had written everything down in her diary, preserving the final moments of her family's life for whoever might eventually find them. To whoever finds this, she wrote in the final entry, her handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. Please know that we were good people. We were deceived. We trusted someone who did not deserve our trust. We believed in something, and that belief destroyed us. Please do not judge us too harshly. Please do not think of us as fools, even though we were. Please remember us not as victims of our own stupidity, but as a family who loved each other. That is all we ever were. That is all we ever wanted to be. She died with the diary pressed against her chest, her arms wrapped around it, as if she were holding a child. When the investigators found her, 50 years later, the diary was still there, still clutched in her skeletal embrace, still waiting for someone to read it. I read those words standing in the police station, my hands trembling, tears streaming down my face. The investigators had allowed me to see a copy of the diary, as a courtesy for being the one who had found the room. I had not expected to be so moved by it. I had not expected to feel such a deep, personal connection to a family I had never met, to a young woman who had died decades before I was born. But Catherine's words, her honesty and her vulnerability and her desperate hope that someone would remember her family, had touched something in me that I couldn't explain. I thought about my own family, my wife, Elena, who was waiting for me at home, probably worried sick after hearing about the discovery on the news. My children, Sophie and Michael, who would be full of questions when I got back, who would want to know every detail of the adventure their father had stumbled into. I thought about how much I loved them, how much they meant to me, how empty my life would be without them. And I thought about Theodore and Eleanor and William and Margaret and Catherine, who had loved each other just as fiercely, and who had died together in the darkness because they had trusted the wrong person. The search for Jonathan Crane became a national obsession. Reporters descended on Millbrook, filling the streets with camera crews and satellite trucks. The story was everywhere, on every news channel, in every newspaper, and every website. People were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. How could someone do something so terrible? How could someone convince a family to seal themselves in a hidden room and leave them to die? And where was Jonathan Crane now? The answers to those questions came slowly, in fragments and pieces, over the course of several months. Crane had left Millbrook shortly after the Ashford family disappeared, telling his remaining followers that he was going on a spiritual journey to prepare for the apocalypse. He had traveled across the country, changing his name and his appearance, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and shattered communities. He had continued to lead his cult, recruiting new members and convincing them to give him their money and their loyalty and, in at least one other documented case, their lives. By the time the authorities finally caught up with him, he was living in a compound in the mountains of Montana, surrounded by followers who believed he was a prophet and who were utterly devoted to his teachings. The arrest was dramatic, captured on camera by news helicopters that circled overhead as FBI agents stormed the compound. Crane was taken into custody without resistance, his face blank and expressionless as he was led away in handcuffs. He was an old man now, in his late 80s, his once piercing blue eyes dimmed by age and illness. But there was still something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that suggested the charisma and the menace that had once commanded the devotion of so many. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, as well as numerous other crimes related to his cult activities. The trial was expected to be one of the most watched in American history, a spectacle that would dominate the news for months. But it never happened. 3 weeks after his arrest, Jonathan Crane died of a heart attack in his jail cell. The official cause of death was natural causes, but there were those who whispered that he had taken his own life, that he had found a way to cheat justice just as he had cheated everything else in his miserable existence. I was there when they buried the Ashford family. The town had come together to give them a proper funeral, a ceremony that was attended by hundreds of people who had grown up hearing the legend of Blackthorn Manor and the family who had vanished. The mayor gave a speech, talking about the importance of remembering the past and learning from its tragedies. The local minister offered a prayer, asking for peace for the souls of the departed and for healing for the community that had been shaken by their discovery. And I stood in the back, watching as 5 coffins were lowered into the ground, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Catherine's diary was published with the permission of the few remaining distant relatives of the Ashford family. It became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions of people around the world. Her words, her final plea to be remembered, had been heard. The Ashford family was no longer a footnote in the history of a small town. They were a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith and the terrible things that can happen when people trust the wrong person. As for Blackthorn Manor, it still stands at the end of that winding road on the outskirts of Millbrook. Richard Hartley, the developer who had hired me, decided not to go through with his plans for a boutique hotel. The notoriety of the discovery, the endless stream of reporters and curiosity seekers and true crime enthusiasts, had made it impossible to continue with the renovations. Instead, he sold the property to the Town Historical Society, which turned it into a museum, a memorial to the Ashford family and a reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. The hidden room was preserved exactly as we found it, with a glass wall installed in the doorway so that visitors could look inside without disturbing the scene. The 5 chairs were still there, arranged in their eternal circle, and on the wall beside the door, a plaque had been installed, bearing the final words of Catherine's diary. Please remember us not as fools, but as a family who loved each other. I go there sometimes, when I can't sleep, when the memories of that day are too strong to ignore. I stand in front of that glass wall, looking at the 5 empty chairs, and I think about the people who sat in them 50 years ago. I think about their hopes and their fears and their desperate, misguided faith. I think about the darkness that surrounded them in their final hours, and the love that sustained them even as everything else was stripped away. And I think about the nature of trust, about the power of belief, about the fine line between faith and foolishness, between hope and delusion. The Ashford family did not die because they were weak or stupid or deserving of their fate. They died because they trusted someone who exploited that trust for his own purposes. They died because they believed in something bigger than themselves, and they were betrayed by a man who used that belief as a weapon. There is a lesson in that, a warning that I carry with me everywhere I go. Trust is a gift, a precious and fragile thing. It should be given carefully, cautiously, to those who have earned it. And once given, it should be honored and protected. Because when trust is broken, when faith is betrayed, the consequences can be devastating. They can echo across decades, across generations, across the vast and indifferent expanse of time. The room had been sealed for 50 years, and I was the one who found it. That fact still haunts me, still visits me in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refuses to come and the darkness presses in around me like a living thing. But it also reminds me, every day, of the importance of truth, of the danger of blind faith, of the precious, fragile nature of life, and of the 5 people who sat in a circle in the darkness, holding hands, waiting for someone to come, and who were forgotten by everyone except each other. They are not forgotten anymore.